the Scots queen who signed her own death warrant. It began not with a signature, but with an explosion. In the dead of night in February 1567, the Kirkhofield house in Edinburgh was torn apart by gunpowder. The lifeless body of Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, Mary's husband, was found in the garden, strangled. The whispers started before the smoke even cleared. All fingers pointed to the ambitious James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. And when Mary married Bothwell just 3 months later, the whispers turned into a roar. The people, the nobles, and the fiery Protestant preachers condemned her. She was marked as an adulteress and a murderer, a queen who had conspired in regicide. The reckoning was swift. The Scottish lords rose in rebellion. Mary's forces met them at Carberry Hill, but there was no glorious battle. Her men melted away, and she was taken prisoner. Her captors marched her through the streets of Edinburgh, a jeering crowd screaming, "Burn the whore," at their anointed queen. But the true humiliation was still to come. They took her to Lochleven Castle, a grim fortress on an island in the middle of a lake. There, isolated and broken, she suffered a miscarriage. She was barely clinging to life, physically weak and mentally shattered. It was in this state of utter vulnerability that the Lord saw their chance to legally strip her of her power. On July 24, 1567, they sent a delegation to her prison chamber. The instrument of her doom was carried by a man whose very presence was a threat, Lord Lindsay. This was the same man Mary had once threatened with beheading, and his eyes held a cold, merciless fury. He placed 3 documents before the bedridden queen. The first was an act of abdication, resigning her crown to her infant son, James. The second appointed her illegitimate half-brother, the Earl of Murray, as regent. The third named a council to govern until Murray could return. Mary refused. She was a sovereign by divine right, an anointed Queen of Scotland and Dowager Queen of France. With what authority could mere lords demand she sign away her birthright? She wept, she protested, she defied them. But Lord Riven and Robert Melville were there too, and Melville, feigning friendship, whispered a poisonously practical piece of advice. He told her that a signature made under duress, by a prisoner, was legally worthless. It would be invalid the moment she was free. Sign now, he urged, to save your life, and you can repudiate it later. Mary hesitated, her mind surely racing. Then Lord Lindsay's patience snapped. He loomed over her, a towering figure of brute force, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He did not need to speak the threat aloud. His stern countenance and fierce manner were enough. The message was clear: sign, or you will not leave this room alive. Terrified, ill, and seeing no other way to live another day, Mary Stuart took the pen. She did not even read what she signed. With the stroke of a quill, she who had been Queen of Scotland since she was 6 days old was queen no more. It was an illegal act, a stain on Scottish honour that would later be sanctified by a forced Privy Seal, when Lindsay assaulted the deputy keeper, Thomas Sinclair, in his own home and physically compelled him to stamp the documents. Just 5 days later, on the strength of that forced signature, her infant son was crowned James VI. The Confederate lord swore a most false oath that Mary had resigned of her own free will. Against all odds, Mary escaped from Lochleven and raised an army. But defeat came again at the Battle of Langside. Now, with all hope lost in Scotland, she made the fateful decision that would lead her to a second fateful warrant. She fled south into England, throwing herself on the mercy of her cousin, Elizabeth I. She could not have made a worse calculation. To Elizabeth, Mary was not a cousin in need. She was a magnet for every Catholic plot in Europe, a living, breathing alternative to the Protestant English throne. Instead of receiving a helping hand, Mary was placed under house arrest. For 19 years, she was moved from one manor to another, a gilded prisoner. Her gaolers changed, from the lenient Earl of Shrewsbury to the harsh Puritan Sir Amias Powlett, but her cage never opened. She passed the years embroidering, praying, and writing endless letters, scheming for her freedom. Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, saw Mary as a devilish woman who could never be allowed to live if his queen were to be safe. He needed a way to catch her in an act of unforgivable treason. In 1586, his trap was sprung. He allowed a young, idealistic Catholic nobleman named Anthony Babington to believe he could communicate secretly with Mary. Letters were hidden in a waterproof box and smuggled in a beer barrel delivered to her residence at Chartley Castle. Babington poured out the details of a grand plan: a Spanish invasion, a Catholic uprising, and the assassination of Elizabeth. All Mary had to do was give her blessing. Walsingham's cryptographer, Thomas Phillips, intercepted and deciphered every single letter. He waited for Mary to incriminate herself. And on July 17, 1586, she did. In her reply, Mary explicitly agreed to the plot, sanctioning the murder of a fellow queen. When Phillips decoded her response, he drew a small set of gallows on the paper. The trap was shut. Mary was arrested and taken to Fotheringhay Castle, a dark and mournful place in the flatlands of Northamptonshire, for her final trial. She defended herself with regal dignity, denying the court's authority to judge a foreign queen. Look to your consciences and remember that the theatre of the whole world is wider than the kingdom of England, she warned her triers. It was futile. She was sentenced to death. This left Elizabeth with a terrible, history-altering decision. The warrant for Mary's execution was prepared, but for months, Elizabeth wavered. She was horrified by the precedent of killing an anointed monarch. She feared the wrath of Catholic Europe, especially Spain. She feared her own conscience. She wanted Mary dead, but she did not want blood on her hands. She even suggested to Powlett, Mary's jailer, that he simply murder Mary privately under the ambiguous bond of association. Powlett, a man of strict Puritan conscience, furiously refused to make so foul a shipwreck of my conscience. Finally, on February 1, 1587, Elizabeth could delay no longer. She summoned her secretary, William Davison, and demanded the warrant. With a stroke of the pen, she signed the paper that ordered the execution of her cousin. But even then, she did not give it force. She told Davison not to seal it with the Great Seal yet, to do nothing more. She spoke of perhaps asking Powlett once more to do the deed quietly. But the Privy Council, led by the ruthless William Cecil, Lord Burghley, had waited long enough. They took Elizabeth's signed warrant, sealed it without her knowledge, and dispatched the document to Fotheringhay. In their minds, the Queen had made her decision. Now they would carry it out before she could change her mind again. The signed warrant, the final, irrevocable death sentence, was now out of her hands. On the afternoon of February 7, 1587, the Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent arrived at Mary's room. They read the warrant aloud. Mary listened calmly, then crossed herself. I am happy to have for the honor of my religion, and of myself, the death which I have so long expected, she said. That night, she wrote her last letter to the King of France. She prayed. She distributed her remaining possessions to her faithful servants. She did not sleep. In the early hours of the morning, she composed her will, her mind clear despite the axe that awaited her. At 8 o'clock on the morning of February 8th, the Provost Marshal came for her. Mary Stuart entered the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle. A scaffold draped in black stood before her. She had dressed not in the black of mourning, but in the crimson of a Catholic martyr, a final, silent sermon. When her outer garments were removed, she stood in a bodice and petticoat of deep blood red. She walked to the block as if approaching an altar. She forgave the executioner, kneeling to say in Latin, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." She placed her neck upon the cold wood. The first blow of the axe missed its mark, slicing into the back of her skull. A second blow was needed to sever her head. As the executioner lifted her head by the hair to cry, "God save the Queen," the auburn locks came away in his hand. It was a wig. The head of Mary, Queen of Scots, tumbled to the floor, revealing the short, grey hair of a woman who had aged 20 years in captivity. And then, as witnesses watched in horror, a small, frightened dog crept out from under her skirts, whimpering beside the body of its mistress. When news reached London, Elizabeth erupted in a fury of carefully curated rage. She had not meant it. The council had tricked her. William Davison was thrown into the Tower of London as a scapegoat. But the deed was done. The regicide was complete. The signature of one queen had set the axe in motion, just as the forced signature of another, 20 years earlier, had started the long, dark journey to that black-draped scaffold. With the axe falling at Fotheringhay. But to truly understand the depth of this tragedy, we must look beyond that bloody scaffold and follow the ripples that spread across kingdoms and generations. This is not merely the story of two signatures. It is the story of a son who would inherit everything, and a cousin who would be haunted until her final breath. Let us go back, for a moment, to that room in Lochleven. Imagine the scratching of the quill as Mary, feverish and terrified, signed away her crown. She convinced herself, as Melville had whispered, that it was meaningless. A signature forced from a prisoner was no signature at all. And yet, that piece of paper took on a monstrous life of its own. It became the legal foundation for her son's regency. It became the excuse for her exile. It became the first link in a chain that would drag her across the border and into Elizabeth's grasp. She spent the next 20 years writing letters, pleading with foreign courts, trying to undo what that single stroke of a pen had done. But ink, once dry, is stubborn. It clings to the page long after the hand that wrote it has withered. Her own signature, forced or not, was used against her again and again. She had signed her name to the idea that a queen could be unmade by men. And what of the other signature, the one Elizabeth Tudor scratched onto the warrant in February of 1587? We often imagine that moment as decisive, a cold-hearted queen ridding herself of a rival. The truth is infinitely more complex, more human, and far more tragic. Elizabeth did not want to sign. She had kept that warrant for months, carrying it with her, staring at it, sleeping with it nearby perhaps. She was a woman who knew intimately what it meant to be a princess in peril, to have the axe hanging over one's own neck. Her own mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed on the orders of her father. A signed warrant had made Elizabeth a bastard and an orphan in a single stroke. How could she, of all people, take up that same terrible instrument against another anointed queen? The pressure on her was immense. Parliament demanded Mary's blood. Walsingham's intelligence painted a picture of a Europe teeming with assassins, all inspired by the captive queen. Philip of Spain was building his armada, and Mary's death would be the spark that ignited it. Every day Mary lived, Elizabeth was in danger. And yet, Elizabeth hesitated. She hinted. She schemed. She tried to find another way, any other way. She raged at her council, calling them beasts and ingrates. She was a woman walking a tightrope between her conscience and her crown. When she finally signed the warrant, she did it in a moment of anger, frustration, and perhaps, deep down, despair. She knew what she was doing, even if she could not bring herself to admit it. Then came the aftermath. The messenger had ridden north. The deed was done before she could truly recall the words she had spoken. When the news reached her, her performance was spectacular. She screamed. She wept. She tore at her clothes. She banished Davison, her secretary, to the Tower, ruining his life as a burnt offering to her own guilt. She wrote to King James of Scotland, her victim's own son, swearing on her soul that she had never meant for it to happen. "I am innocent," she cried, "I am innocent." But she was not innocent. She had signed the paper. The paper had been sealed. a queen was dead. Elizabeth knew, as she looked at herself in the mirror in the days that followed, that she had committed an act that could never be undone. She had crossed a line that no monarch should cross. She had killed a fellow sovereign, a cousin, a woman who had once been a guest in her kingdom. The guilt, I believe, never left her. It was a shadow that walked beside her for the remaining 16 years of her life. And now, let us turn to the most overlooked figure in this entire tragedy. The boy who became king because his mother was forced to sign a paper, and who became the heir to England because the English Queen signed another. James Charles Stuart. He was barely a year old when his mother was deposed. He was 13 months when he was crowned King of Scotland in a hurried ceremony, while his mother was a prisoner in the very lake he could see from his nursery window. He grew up in a world of stern Presbyterian tutors, men like George Buchanan, who filled his young mind with poisonous stories about his mother. Buchanan, who had once been Mary's admirer, turned into her most vicious detractor. He told the boy that his mother was a whore, a murderess, a papist whore of Babylon. He wrote histories that painted Mary as a monster, and James was forced to read them, forced to nod, forced to internalize the idea that the woman who gave him life was a creature of evil. Imagine the psychological torment. James Stuart, a boy with a crown but no mother. He saw portraits of her, but he could not touch her. He received letters from her in her English prisons, filled with desperate love and pleas for help, but his regents told him to ignore them. What could he do? He was a child, then a teenager, a king in name only. As he grew older, he learned the art of political survival. The nobles who held him were the same ones who had betrayed his mother. To openly mourn her would be to question their legitimacy, and by extension, his own. So he developed a kind of careful, diplomatic silence. He did not rage against Elizabeth for holding his mother captive. He did not threaten war. He made quiet, behind-the-scenes gestures of protest when it seemed politically safe, but he never risked his own position or his chance at the English succession for her sake. When the warrant was signed and Mary was executed, James's reaction was a masterclass in the very political cunning that would define his reign. In public, he expressed outrage. He broke off diplomatic relations, recalled his ambassador, and allowed the border lords a bit of licensed raiding. He had to do something. His honor as a son and as a king demanded it. But in private? In private, the dance began. Elizabeth sent him letters of profuse, theatrical grief. She swore her innocence, blamed her counselors, and offered him her enduring love as a dear sister and mother. And James, calculating and pragmatic to his core, accepted it. He accepted the lie. He accepted the apology. He accepted the blood money, in a sense, because the ultimate prize was now in sight. The English throne. He was Elizabeth's closest Protestant heir. All he had to do was wait, and not make too much of a fuss about his murdered mother. He succeeded. He waited. He kept his mouth shut and his eyes on the prize. And when Elizabeth finally died in 1603, James Stuart, the son of the executed queen, rode south to London to claim the crown of the woman who had ordered his mother's death. He was crowned King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The union of the crowns was achieved. The child of the abdication warrant now sat on the throne of the woman who signed the execution warrant. It is one of history's most astonishing ironies. When James reached Westminster Abbey, one of his first acts was a profound, and profoundly human, one. He commissioned a magnificent marble tomb for his mother in the very same abbey where Elizabeth herself would soon be buried. It was a tomb fit for a martyr, a queen, a legend. He had her body exhumed from its ignoble grave at Peterborough Cathedral and brought to this place of supreme honor. It was a silent, posthumous victory. Mary, who had lost everything, was now enshrined in death in the pantheon of English monarchs, right across the aisle from the woman who had ordered her killing. If you visit Westminster Abbey today, you can see them. Two queens, Two signatures, two fates, lying in marble splendor under the same vast roof. Elizabeth's effigy is stiff, regal, powerful. Mary's is beautiful, peaceful, almost saintly. A son had, in the only way he could, finally come to his mother's rescue. But the story of Mary and Elizabeth is not just a story of politics. It is a story of two women who were, in many ways, mirror images. Elizabeth, the Protestant Virgin Queen, ruling through her wits, playing the game of marriage but never surrendering. Mary, the Catholic femme fatale, ruled by her heart, making disastrous choices in love that destroyed her kingdoms. They were foils, rivals, cousins, and perhaps, in some strange way, reflections of what the other might have been. They never met. Not once. For 20 years, Mary wrote to Elizabeth, begging for a meeting, a conversation, a chance to look into her cousin's eyes and resolve their differences. Elizabeth always refused. Perhaps she was afraid. Afraid that if she saw Mary, if she saw the face of the woman she held captive, her resolve would crumble. So she kept Mary at a distance, a myth, a threat, a paper construct made of intercepted letters and spy reports. The signatures on the warrants were the closest they ever came. Ink on paper, deciding a life. Consider for a moment the life Mary led in captivity. The gilded cage was still a cage. She was moved from Sheffield Castle to Tutbury to Chartley to Fotheringhay, each one a damp, cold prison, each one a new kind of torture. Her health, ruined since Lochleven, deteriorated. She suffered from rheumatism so severe she could barely walk. She was attended by a dwindling household of faithful servants, but their loyalty could not buy her freedom. She spent her days doing needlework. If you look at the embroideries she created during those years, you see a heartbreaking story. She stitched emblems of hope and despair. A phoenix rising from flames, with the motto, "In my end is my beginning." A mouse and a cat, with the caption, "Beware of the cat." She was not just passing time. She was writing her autobiography in silk and thread. She was making a record of her suffering, a message in a bottle thrown into the sea of history. And all the while, the plot swirled around her. Was she a willing conspirator, or a fly caught in a web she could not escape? The Babington plot, the one that finally brought her down, is a study in entrapment. Walsingham created a secret channel of communication and then watched as the desperate, isolated Queen swam right into it. When Mary wrote her fatal letter, agreeing to Elizabeth's assassination, she was not signing a political document. She was signing her own name to a desperate, reckless gamble for life. She had been told by Babington that 6 gentlemen would undertake the tragic execution of the usurper. Mary, after 19 years of imprisonment, with her health failing and her hope extinguished, finally said yes. Do it. It was treason, certainly. It was a crime. But was it anything more than what any caged creature would do when a door was suddenly, briefly, left open? The signature that sealed her fate was not just an act of treason, it was an act of pure, raw, human desperation. She had been broken down, piece by piece, year by year, until the only thing left was the will to be free, no matter the cost. And then we return to that February morning. The walk from her chambers to the Great Hall at Fotheringhay. She knew she was walking into legend. She orchestrated her own death with the precision of a theatre director. The red undergarments, signifying martyrdom in the Catholic faith. The crucifix and prayer book clutched in her hands. The long, deliberate walk, supported by her servants. She was no longer a prisoner. She had seized control of the narrative. She was the star of her own passion play. The Protestant officials who tried to rush her, to bully her, to convert her in her final moments, were reduced to bit players in her drama. When they demanded that the Dean of Peterborough pray for her, she drowned him out by reciting psalms in Latin. When the executioner knelt to ask her forgiveness, she gave it freely, telling him, "I forgive you with all my heart, for now, I hope, you shall make an end of all my troubles. The scaffold was her stage. The block was her altar. The axe was her instrument of salvation. And in that moment, she won. Elizabeth had taken her crown, her freedom, her youth, and finally her life. But Mary took something from Elizabeth that morning. She took the moral high ground. She became the martyr that Elizabeth feared she would become. The image of the dignified queen kneeling in red, dying for her faith, was more powerful than any army. It was a seed planted in the hearts of Catholics across Europe, a seed that would bloom into the Spanish Armada, into centuries of romantic legend, into plays and poems and operas. Elizabeth won in life. Mary won in death. The story of the two signatures is, in the end, a story about power and its limits. The forced signature at Lochleven proved that you can compel a body to move a pen, but you cannot compel a soul to abdicate. Mary revoked that signature the moment she was free, and she continued to sign herself Mary, Queen, until the day she died. The execution warrant at Greenwich proved that a queen can order a death, but she cannot control its consequences. Elizabeth's signature killed her cousin, but it also haunted her conscience, tarnished her legacy, and, in a twist of fate, ensured that Mary's son would inherit everything. Think about the pen itself. A fragile, feathered thing, dipped in ink. The same instrument used to write love letters and poetry was also used to write sentences of death. Mary, who had once signed marriage contracts with hope, signed her abdication with despair. Elizabeth, who had signed treaties and sonnets, signed a death warrant with a trembling hand. The power to write is the power to create and to destroy. The power to sign one's name is the power to say, "This is my will. Let it be done." And yet, for both of these women, the signature was an admission that their power was not absolute. Mary was forced to sign, revealing that a queen's body can be broken by the will of men. Elizabeth was coerced by circumstance to sign, revealing that a queen's will can be bent by the demands of state. Two queens, two signatures, two women who learned in the most brutal way that to wear a crown is not to be free, but to be bound in chains heavier than any prisoner ever wore. And as the years passed, and James ruled in London, he tried to balance the legacy of both his mothers. He called Elizabeth his blessed predecessor, but he built a glorious tomb for Mary. He wrote books on the divine right of kings, arguing that no mortal man could judge a sovereign, a philosophy born directly from the trauma of his mother's trial and execution. The little boy who had lost everything never forgot. He just learned to hide it. When he commissioned that tomb in Westminster, with its beautiful white marble effigy of Mary, he gave her a crown she could never lose, a scepter she could never drop, and a peace she had never known in life. The signature at Lochleven had stripped her of these things. The signature at Greenwich had sealed her fate. But the son, the product of her doomed union with Darnley, the very child she was forced to abandon, restored her in effigy, in history, and in legend. So, the next time you put pen to paper, think of them. Think of the weight of your own name. Mary Stuart, who signed because she feared death, and received it 20 years later. Elizabeth Tudor, who signed because she feared life with a rival, and lived to regret it. Two signatures. One a surrender, one a command. But both of them, in their own way, were a death warrant. The Scots queen who signed away her kingdom, and the English queen who signed away her cousin. In the theatre of history, they are forever linked, forever opposed, forever signing documents in rooms far apart, setting in motion the events that would bring them together in the end, under the vaulted stone of an abbey, at the close of a tragedy written not by a playwright, but by the queens themselves.